Welcome and good evening. My name is Jeffrey Baum. I'm a distinguished fellow of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council, and I can't tell you how pleased I am to be here today to help introduce the Dan Schnur Political Report, this monthly edition. As many of you know, the Los Angeles World Affairs Council is a vibrant organization. We have several outstanding upcoming events. Next Thursday, for those of you who are participate in our Young Professionals program, we have a program on Hollywood and China that features a Wall Street Journal reporter named Eric Schwartzel, who has a new book out on that. If you haven't been to our website recently, go to our website and you can register for that event. And on November 20th, 2 weeks from today, we are doing a special program with the Consulate of Mexico in the United States and the Latin American consular community. And we're calling it, including the Consulate of El Salvador. And we will be doing a special program at a private residence in Hancock Park. And you will have the opportunity to register for that. One of the things that you should know is that the Los Angeles World Affairs Council, if you haven't heard already, is a nonprofit organization, and we rely on donors and individuals to support the work of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council to bring programming like this to you free of charge and to share it across the community and across the world. And one of the things that we also ask is for support for a program that involves high school students. We are working with dozens of high school students across Los Angeles and bring the high school students in contact with diplomats and public policy leaders. In fact, just yesterday, we hosted a forum for 200 students and community leaders with our district attorney, Nathan Hochman. And so we welcome your participation in that, but we also welcome your support for events like this. So before we go into the main program, this is a very special time for me because I have admired Dan Schnur for decades. Dan doesn't want me to mention how long we've collaborated, and there's nobody who is more insightful, but also more compassionate and more thoughtful about where we are, where we've been, but also where we're going. And it's a big week, obviously. We had an election both in California and across the country yesterday, and even some news has been breaking today that I'm sure Dan will be sharing with the audience. So it's my honor to introduce both a dear friend and a remarkable and well-respected analyst and a member of the board of directors of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council, Dan Schnur. Dan, it's all yours.
Well, Jeff, thank you very much. And I think I speak on behalf of our entire board and our membership about how excited we are to have you involved. For all of you who may not know Jeff, he's been a respected leader at USC, at the Annenberg Center, at the Milken Institute, and now lucky for us at the World Affairs Council. He and I have been friends for, as he alluded to, many, many years. And I'm really excited to have the chance to work with him again. Of course, I'm excited to talk with all of you, as always. And as Jeff alluded to briefly before he signed off, while our prepared topics for tonight are primarily economic, it's been a while since we've had an in-depth economic discussion on this program. We've talked a lot about Gaza and about Ukraine, of course. We've talked about immigration policy. We've talked about China. We've had no shortage of topics to cover in the political world. And of course, the government shutdown, which continues in Washington. But we did want to spend a good amount of time tonight talking economic policy, particularly trade policy, as well as some of the longer-term ramifications at stake here. But like is the case with us every week, the news tends to get in the way. And there's no shortage of news this week. And we'll start with today's news about former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi announcing her retirement. And for anyone who joins a program like this one, you're not only already aware of Representative Pelosi's decision, but you already probably know a great deal about her career and have been reminded about some of the highlights of her career over the course of today as the media has covered her story very thoroughly. But I wanted to talk about a couple things briefly about Pelosi that haven't gotten as much attention on her retirement, which I think are really important. So we all know, of course, that she's the first woman ever to be elected Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, and she became the first Speaker some years ago. But I find myself talking to people who might not have been following politics for quite as long as Jeff and I have, that it's worth remembering that when she first came to Congress in the late 20th century, she was very widely dismissed, not by just by Republicans, but by many of her Democratic colleagues. Keep in mind, she never held elective office, and the seat that she filled had been held for many, many years by the legendary member of Congress, Phil Burton, who'd been one of the real powers in California and national politics for decades. When he passed away, Burton's widow asked Pelosi if she would be willing to follow him. And Nancy Pelosi had been the chair of the California Democratic Party, but she'd ascended to that role primarily because of her tremendous fundraising capabilities. And so when she got to Washington in the late 80s, as a woman, who had never run for or been elected to public office, and as a woman who came from a family with considerable wealth, a lot of people, Republicans and Democrats alike, really dismissed her as just this wealthy woman, this dilettante, who didn't really know much about politics, but she was there because she was rich and knew lots of rich other people. And she didn't really get taken that seriously for her first years in Congress. And to her credit, whether you happen to be a supporter or an opponent of her ideologically, she worked tremendously hard, along with her colleague Rose DeLauro of Connecticut, on the House Appropriations Committee and gradually gained some respect and some seniority. But when she first ran for Democratic Party whip in the early 21st century, she ran against Maryland Representative Steny Hoyer. And it was widely assumed that Hoyer was going to just clean up and was going to win the race very easily, because he, of course, was a respected leader in the House Democratic Caucus. This Nancy Pelosi was just this rich woman from San Francisco. And Pelosi beat him. And she went on from there upon Dick Gephardt's retiring to be the Democratic leader, the then minority leader of the House of Representatives, and ultimately Speaker. But it is worth remembering that not only is she the first, and at least to date, the only female Speaker, but the skepticism that she overcame in her career in order to get there. The other two things I'll mention about her quickly is one of the frustrating things I would imagine about being a congressional leader is you usually get a lot less credit than presidents, particularly presidents of your own party, for policy accomplishments. So while Pelosi, both as Speaker and as Minority Leader, was instrumental in helping both Presidents Obama and President Biden accomplish many of their legislative goals, she probably didn't get nearly the credit for those accomplishments, even among loyal Democrats, as the presidents themselves. My own feeling is what Pelosi will probably be remembered for, in addition to her breakthrough status as the first woman speaker. I think Pelosi will, ironically, and perhaps for her somewhat frustratingly, be remembered less for the work she did on behalf of Democratic presidents and more to the opposition she led to the Republican president, Donald Trump, during his first term in office between 2017 and 2021. The most iconic image of Pelosi's very long and accomplished career may end up being immediately after a Trump State of the Union address, Pelosi standing up from her chair behind him in the House on the House podium and ripping up a paper copy of his speech. So she may go down in history books for a lot of reasons, but in addition to her gender, I suspect her opposition to Trump is what history will remember her most for. And then finally, lastly, as many of you remember and were probably reminded today, Pelosi played a very instrumental role in Joe Biden's decision to step aside last summer. They had private conversations about it, and it's very clear that Pelosi not only talked to Biden herself, but marshaled any number of other members of Congress and other party leaders to talk to Biden also, and ultimately convince him not to run. But it's also worth noting that Pelosi, at the beginning of that process, made it clear that if Biden did step away, that Pelosi, felt that there should be a competitive process for selecting the party nominee. Of course, as we all know, that's not what happened. When Biden stepped aside, he later that same day endorsed his Vice President Kamala Harris to succeed him as the party's nominee. And though it took a day or two for the party to fall in line, they largely did. Pelosi at that point, I think, realized that there was a freight train moving toward her at 100 miles an hour, and standing in front of it wasn't going to do her any good. So she stepped down, but she had made it very clear that she thought a competitive process would be a better one. And it is worth noting that she and Harris, although both coming from San Francisco, have never been particularly close, either personally or politically. But after all was said and done, after the election, when the dust was settled, when Harris had been defeated by Trump, Pelosi at that point uh, offered an assessment that to me exemplified her very considerable political skills. Again, whether you're a supporter or an opponent of hers, she was asked about Harris's selection as the nominee. And again, had been on the record saying that she had thought there should be a competitive process. Her response was to say, quote, "I was somewhat surprised to see the speed with which President Biden decided to endorse," which, if you think about it, was a very polite but also extraordinarily scathing way of reminding people that if they had listened to her, perhaps the 2024 election in November might have turned out differently. Now, we have no way of knowing that, but I think Pelosi, for both partisans on both sides and beyond that, is a remarkable figure in American political history. And I hope you don't mind that we hijacked a bit of our time at the beginning of tonight's program to talk about her. What that does mean, though, is we're not going to be able to talk about the the national elections that took place this Tuesday. The election for mayor in New York City, the governor's elections in Virginia and New Jersey, of course, the passage of Proposition 50 here. And I will tell you, I'm not only willing, but in fact, eager. If any of you have any questions about any of those elections, we can certainly come back to them later. But I want to focus instead, in just a minute, now that we've talked about Pelosi, now that we've delayed slightly our conversation on the elections, I want to talk about another important matter of current events that took place this week. And that was on Wednesday, the day in between the election and Pelosi's announcement. And on Wednesday, just yesterday, when the US Supreme Court heard arguments for and against in a remarkable trial, judging the constitutionality of the tariffs that the president and the Trump administration has imposed over the course of his time in office. We'll talk in just a couple of minutes about the case itself, but ultimately, this is the highest court in the judicial branch of government deciding whether Trump has overstepped by imposing these tariffs unilaterally without congressional approval. Um, More broadly, as we've discussed in the past, Trump's action reflects spreading protectionist sentiments in both parties that have grown tremendously in recent years. And we're going to get into this more in a minute, but before we do, because we're now almost a quarter after 5, wow, we better get to the first poll question before Maddie and Krista get very angry with me. So before I start talking in depth about the tariffs, I'm going to ask you, and I'd ask you to separate Trump from this question. Don't think of them as Trump's tariffs. Think more broadly. Are tariffs generally, do they help or hurt the US economy? Option one, do they help the economy? Are they good for the economy? Number two, do they hurt the economy? Are they bad for the economy? Third, both. They can both help and hurt. Or fourth, I'm not sure. And I know from the makeup of our group that if we personalize this about Trump's tariffs, we'll see a pretty one-sided outcome. But if you separate out the partisanship and recognize that Trump, like Biden before him, have implemented a more protectionist agenda than we've seen in recent American history, what do you think? Do tariffs in general, do they help or hurt our economy? Krista, what have we got? Wow. Now that is not a that is a much more uh, 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 That's much more of a one-sided response than I was expecting. 1% believes that tariffs help our economy. 71%, almost three-quarters of our group, believe that they hurt the economy. 24% say both. And a few people, being honest with us, are just not sure. And what I would offer is that while I personally agree with most of you, I am an avowed free trader, it is worth noting how out of step with national public opinion among both Republicans and Democrats we are in that regard. So Trump has certainly pushed this agenda to a new extreme, but it is worth remembering that Biden during his presidency reversed any number of Obama and Clinton era, and for that matter, not just Obama and Clinton, but Bush and Reagan free trade priorities. And history tells us, if you look back at 100 plus years of modern American history, after every major economic downturn, after every significant international military engagement, the US and its voters tend to look inward. It happened after World War I and after World War II, not just economically and diplomatically, but militarily. It happened after the Korean, the Vietnam, and both Iraq wars. And it's something we've seen after every major economic downturn also. So after the Great Recession and the COVID-caused recession, after the longest war in American history in Afghanistan, it shouldn't be any surprise that popular sentiment, popular bipartisan sentiment in this country is very much suspicious and wary of free trade. So those of you that I suppose participate in a program sponsored by an event called the World Affairs Council might look at this through a slightly different lens. But it is notable how different our viewpoint as a group is from the overall electorate, talking about voters of both parties.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Dan. And I know we've talked a lot about how our group does tend to sometimes differ from the general public, and I will say that they are very much on top of keeping up with things. And so I'm sure that they're keeping track of the arguments within the Supreme Court on their own. But I do want to ask you, what are the most important things that we're supposed to be paying attention to, or we should be following during yesterday's opening arguments?
So the arguments were fascinating. And for those of you who did not have a chance to keep an eye on them or to read about them today, I'd strongly encourage you to do so. Because while the court does not need to act on this until they reconvene next June, there is great pressure on them to act sooner, and we may see a verdict from them by the end of this calendar year. And the question going in was, would a court that in many ways has given President Trump and his administration an immense amount of leeway on any number of topics be willing to do so here as well? Or would they see this as the type of executive overstep that the Roberts Court has frequently reined in the past? And what was most notable, Maddie, to me about yesterday's questioning is how skeptical most of the justices sound. Now, as we all know by now, there are three justices appointed by Democratic presidents, and they're almost certainly to vote that the tariffs are not constitutional. So opponents of Trump's tariffs, including a large number of Republican members of Congress who quietly do not like these tariffs at all, opponents of the tariffs realized it would take 2 out of the 6 appointees of Republican presidents to support to vote with the Democratic appointees in order to overturn the tariffs. And it was pretty clear from listening to Chief Justice Roberts, from listening to Amy Coney Barrett, from listening to Neil Gorsuch, that there is considerable skepticism among those three justices, at least on a couple of grounds. One, they believe that the Constitution, well, they point to the fact that the Constitution states that it is the Congress's responsibility to impose taxes, and tariffs are a form of taxation, of course, not for the president to do. And they question the president's legal representatives very sharply on that matter. The Trump administration's defense on this has been to cite a law that was passed in the late 1970s, which gives presidents some additional powers during times of emergency. And the White House and Trump administration has argued that we are in a time of emergency right now, necessitating the unilateral action rather than going through Congress. And what became very clear yesterday is several of the justices are very skeptical of the argument that we are in emergency, pointing out that the trade deficits that the Trump administration cites have actually existed for many years, if not decades. And many have pointed to the very personalized um, decisions that Trump has made in imposing tariffs, arguing that this is not a policy-based emergency, but rather the president himself using the tariffs as a lever to achieve other goals. The Trump administration also argues that because tariffs by definition do involve international relations between the US and other countries, that does affect our national security. Also, an argument that the justices felt dubious about. So the most interesting thing to me, Maddie, while we don't know the verdict, at least at the outset, it looks like the court is predisposed to rule against Trump's tariffs. And now, from a practical standpoint, it's not going to make an immense immediate difference because there's other ways that the administration can impose tariffs legally by tying them more directly to national security, by asserting them as temporary measures rather than permanent. And while those more piecemeal steps will be challenged in court too, as we've seen here, the courts, even if ultimately they overturn the tariffs, are inclined not to act until a final verdict has been offered. But the court does seem fairly dubious about all this. And so I'd be surprised if they let a lot of this stand.
That is really interesting. And one running theme that I'm hearing a lot of is just that air of uncertainty that we have. And I want to talk a little bit more broadly about the US recently meeting with leaders from China, Japan, South Korea to discuss trade and tariffs on that, like I said, very broad level. Is the unpredictability of this all really part of the strategy, or is just creating more uncertainty for American businesses? Like, is that really where we're headed?
Well, I think it's both, if not all of the options that you laid out, Maddie. Trump, as we learned in his first term, and as we've seen even more over the last several months, for better or worse, depending on your partisan perspective, revels in unpredictability. And he even talked about this in some of his books, in which he says that by catching your nemesis and negotiating partner off guard and ill prepared for what you offer them, you gain a tactical advantage. And that's something that he believed throughout his business career and still, it's a tactic he still employs very heavily as president. So he not only enjoys the unpredictability, he believes that he and the country realize the strategic benefit from it. And so at a time when he's talked very, very strongly about how the US has been taken advantage of under previous administrations when it comes to international trade, the fact that he prioritized trade agreements in the meetings you mentioned with the leaders of China, with Japan, of South Korea, does seem somewhat unexpected from a messaging and a political standpoint. On the other hand, with all three of these countries, particularly China, there are economic necessities that needed to be addressed and could only be addressed through trade agreements. China, for example, as you know, and as most of our audience knows, controls a large majority of the planet's so-called rare earth minerals, minerals that are used for everything from weaponry to cell phones to electronic appliances. And without access to those minerals, our economy and our military security becomes severely compromised. US farmers have been struggling mightily at the lack of purchases coming from China as a result of an interruption of other trade agreements. And so while politically this is inconsistent for Trump, the economic necessities, I think, forced him into action. The other part of this, real quick, before we move on to our next question for all of you, is like most second-term presidents, Trump has clearly decided that he enjoys foreign policy a lot more than he enjoys domestic policy. And he's not unique at this. Obama, Bush, Reagan, Clinton all went through the same stage also. At a certain point, dealing with Congress just gets sort of irritating. But if you can fly around the world and strike big important deals with other world leaders, that's pretty exciting. And Trump has clearly been enjoying that aspect of his job quite a bit in recent weeks. But the question underneath all of this is Trump argues very forcefully, as have other presidents of both parties, that trade should be a tool used as part of a broader national security strategy. That if we are trying to convince another country not to act in a belligerent or confrontational way with its neighbors, in addition to threatening them diplomatically and militarily, offering some economic consequences to those actions can often be an effective way of deterring action. Now, Trump has fallen under significant criticism for merging the two, but he's not unique in this regard. And so once again, Krista, maybe this is a question for us to ask our group what they think. Once again, separating this away from Trump personally, but for a president, Democrat or Republican, is either rewarding partners with expanded trade opportunities or punishing them by minimizing trade. Are those appropriate levers to get other countries to act or not act in ways that impact their and our national our security? So let's see what we got. Very interesting. 37%, a little bit more than a third, look at that, a little bit more than a third say that yes, trade should be part of our national security strategy. Only 9% say no, that's a 4-to-1 margin. So we've got 53% that say only in some cases. And in retrospect, maybe we shouldn't have given people such an easy out there, because using trade as part of every national security dialogue is probably not appropriate. So the 53% do have a point there. But it is interesting that if you match just the yes and no against each other, a much larger percentage of our group believes that this is the right thing to do, as long as it's done in the right way. So very interesting. For me, Maddie, I do understand the point. You don't want to do it in every single circumstance. But I think picking and choosing when it's appropriate to intermingle the two is, I think, where it gets more complicated.
I think so too. And I was going to really ask for your further in-depth on your perspective there. What role do you ideally see trade playing in shaping America's secure future and the security that we're talking about? And do you think it should just be an economic tool, or do you see the value in it being used for security?
Well, I agree with our group. Both the 4-to-1 margin who said it should be used versus it not being used in a national security context, but also the more than half who correctly pointed out that there are times when it should be used and times when it's not appropriate. And so I think what I would say in terms of distinguishing between those times is, clearly we want to provide for the national security of this country and the people who live here. And as a world leader, we have a responsibility to other parts of the world as well. I worry that if we use trade as a carrot or a stick in every circumstance, it becomes less valuable. And we're already seeing that now as Trump is brandishing more and more tariffs around the world. We're seeing our trading partners recognizing that trading with the US is now going to be much more difficult. So they're beginning to come to agreements with each other. We're seeing Europe, we're seeing Canada, we're seeing Latin America, we're seeing our Asian Pacific allies, even while their trade with the US is decreasing, making efforts to increase it with each other. So I feel like if this is a tool on which we over rely, it's going to have economic consequences for the US, not just benefits. Because not every other country is going to do exactly what we want them to. And if we impose tariffs on every country that doesn't cooperate with us on security issues, we do end up isolating in a way that's not all that helpful. But if we are a little bit more careful and a little bit more selective in how we use those tools and use economic tools along with diplomacy and along with military and national security presence, along with cooperation between our allies, then using it more sporadically, I think has a greater impact than over relying on it. So to wrap up, I agree with a very smart audience. What we did want to talk about for just a little bit, and I realize we're at the bottom of the hour, is Maddie and Krista and Brianna and I are really fortunate. We have an amazing intern who works with us on these programs. Her name is Natalie Lacoub, and Natalie has done a tremendous job over the last few months in helping us prepare these webinars. And when she and I were talking last week about economic issues, not surprisingly, as a graduate student herself, Natalie raised the impact of our various economic challenges on young workers, on young people in particular. And so thinking about how all of us in every generation navigate these things is a webinar that we'll need to do in the future. But one question we wanted to include, at least for a couple of minutes before we move on, is to focus specifically on how young people are affected by such unsettled economic circumstances. We know that unemployment among young people is higher than any other generation. You've all probably seen the studies that show that AI in the next 5 years is predicted to eliminate 50% of entry-level white-collar jobs. And our students certainly know that. This semester in my classes, for the first time, some of their instructors forbid the use of AI in class. I've told the students that, in fact, that starting this semester, I'm going to require it because I want to prepare them for workplaces in which that is a tool that their employers will expect them to be comfortable using. So, coming of age and entering the workforce is always a challenge, regardless of the generation. But the challenges seem particularly significant here. And so, Krista, maybe we can put our fourth question. We'll skip over. Here we go. What causes the most? We're going to ask you all of this. What causes the most frustration, do you think? And think about your children, think about your grandchildren, or your younger employees. What do you think causes the most frustration among unemployed young workers today? And what I'll add, just moderator's prerogative, is we'll say unemployed or underemployed young workers. Because while someone doesn't have a job at all is a real crisis, someone with a college degree or degrees working as a barista is an almost as frustrating experience. And that's become much more commonplace. So what causes the most frustration, in your opinion, among both unemployed and underemployed young workers today? Is it inflation and the rising cost of housing, of food, of other essentials? Is it technology and AI, like I was talking about a moment ago? Is it simply the lack of jobs? There just simply aren't enough jobs for educated young people. Or fourth, is it student debt? Because so many students, of course, as we know, when they graduate, have incurred debt over the course of their college and or graduate school careers to the point where it limits the types of jobs that they're able to take. So there's a lot of other things that probably cause that frustration, and Maddie and Krista can probably talk to it much more than I can. But I think by the fact that we are hard to have your answers up there means that Krista clearly does not want to offer her opinion on this. But look at that, 76% of you, more than 3/4, say simply it's a lack of jobs. Inflation, technology, student debt all play a role. But 3/4 of our respondents say simply, if there were more jobs available, this would not be nearly as much of a problem. Now, ironically, one of the most persistent arguments that supporters of President Trump's immigration agenda use when they talk about more restrictive immigration policy is just that. They say that by restricting the number of immigrants, whether documented or undocumented, who come into this country, they say if we restrict the numbers who can come into this country, that will allow there to be more jobs available to native-born or legally residing Americans, young and old. So I don't think that was the motivation behind the answer to our particular poll question, but certainly worth noting. I do think um, I do think the other factors probably play a little bit more of a role than our group did, but I'll certainly concede the broader point that once you have a job, the rest of it, while not perfect, does make the rest of it much easier.
It's a very good point, and I'd have to agree with you, although I think I might have voted differently. But I think that we're really keeping with that theme of uncertainty, and we're really still there. And I'm wondering how much you think, that the younger workers' frustration is tied to inflation versus the lack of job opportunities like our group voted for.
Well, I really do think it's a combination of those factors. And it is worth noting that unemployment, while relatively low overall in this country, is highest among young people, and in particular among working class young people. And of course, working class is the very polite term we use in 21st century America to refer to those who do not have a college education. Um, so no question that even in a relatively low level of unemployment, that lack of jobs does cause great frustration. But I think it is worth including not only the other factors that we discussed in the previous poll question, but also the nature of the jobs. And some of you have heard me talk about this before. I believe we're living in a time of the greatest economic change and economic and societal dislocation since the Industrial Revolution. And just as was the case 100 plus years ago, when we transformed from an agriculture-based economy to a manufacturing-based economy, our current transition from a manufacturing-based economy to a technology-based economy, I believe is just as disruptive and just as jarring. And for many Americans, young and old, the path through that transition is much less clear than it was during the Industrial Revolution. Back in the late 19th, early 20th century, um, millions of young Americans left their family farm or their rural communities or their small towns, and they came to the big city because they knew there were jobs there in factories, in industry, in commerce. They might not have liked making that move. They might have preferred to stay with their family, their friends, and their loved ones. But the pathway there was a pretty clear one. Today, I don't know that we can say that. If you're an out of work factory worker in Northeastern Ohio or an underemployed industrial working class worker in the Rust Belt, you know that it's probably fairly unlikely that you're going to move to Silicon Valley and get financing for a social media startup. And so those next steps are much more difficult ones now, even than they were a century ago when we went through this last great transformation. And although we've moved on a bit in this conversation from trade, I'll bring this up back full circle before we wrap. One of the things that has made so many people in our country so wary of international trade is their belief, often correct, that increased trade costs American jobs because those same products, of course, can be made less expensively in other parts of the world. And presidents and Congresses of both parties for years, for decades, for generations have always said there'll be more winners than there are losers. But they've always acknowledged that there will be people who lose out because of this transition. And presidents and Congresses of both parties have always made it clear that they want to provide worker support, worker retraining, transitions to help people acclimate to this new reality. And the very sad fact of the matter is we very rarely follow through on those commitments. And so the fact that we now have a couple of generations of working class voters who were told that they would be helped through this transition and weren't, it shouldn't surprise us that so many, such large majorities of our fellow Americans are so wary of free trade. Okay, we've got plenty else we could talk about, particularly as it relates to young people, but I'm guessing most of that's going to have to wait till December. Is that right, Maddie?
I would say so. I think our group's getting curious.
All right, well, let's go on to their questions then.
All right, let's move right into it. Okay, first question is, in what ways did Trump leverage military actions against Venezuela and Cuba to support tariffs under IEEPA and reinforce U.S. dominance, particularly after his Greenland and Canada proposals failed?
Okay. And Maddie, you cut out for just one moment. I think it's my server, not yours. Do you mind repeating the question?
Not at all. In what ways did Trump leverage military actions against Venezuela and Cuba to support tariffs under IEEPA and reinforce U.S. dominance, particularly after his Greenland and Canada proposals failed?
Right, so the question here is what has motivated Trump, particularly as it relates to Venezuela, with this very significant military buildup in the Caribbean? He argues that it's primarily to rein in drug trafficking. His critics point out that Venezuela exports a lot more drugs to Europe than it does to the US. And most of the drugs it exports are either marijuana and cocaine, which cocaine in particular is a matter of great concern. But there's relatively little fentanyl that comes through Venezuela on the way to the US or somewhere else. So if there is an additional motive, Trump himself has occasionally alluded to his growing dislike for Venezuela's leadership, particularly, of course, Maduro. And I think the question the White House is currently wrestling with is they had hoped that these very aggressive steps against drug traffickers would serve as a warning to Maduro and perhaps either encourage him to step down or encourage his opponents to step up. That hasn't happened. So what Trump is now facing is whether he wants to authorize a full-on military invasion of Venezuela or not. Now, Pete Hegseth, his Secretary of Defense, told Congress just this week that while the administration believed there was legal justification for the actions they have taken to date, Hegseth said that there is not a legal justification without congressional approval for a military presence within the country of Venezuela. So is Trump doing this because he wants to stem the drug trade? Probably to some degree. Is he doing it because he wants to get rid of Maduro and replace him? Probably to a much greater degree. And this has been a priority of Marco Rubio's, not just as Secretary of State, but for many years during his time in the United States Senate. And it's clear that Trump is listening to Rubio on this matter, both as it relates to Venezuela and Cuba. But the questioner raises a really interesting point. Is this Trump's way of compensating for efforts earlier in this term, where he attempted to assert himself internationally without success? Is this a way to claim a victory? And I suspect that might be part of it. He believed he had achieved a victory in terms of realizing a peace agreement in Gaza. That peace agreement now looks to be in some question. He's clearly very frustrated at the lack of progress in Ukraine. And although he's spoken very highly of the trade agreements that he and Xi and China have struck, there's obviously a lot of unfinished work there as well. So is some of it drugs? Is some of it Maduro? Is some of it claiming a win? Let's say all of the above.
All right. Thank you so much for that. Our next question is going in a different direction, touching on a previous topic we talked about. Do justices on the Supreme Court ever make deals, trading votes between cases?
There's no way to know. It's a great question. There's no way to know for sure. It's something that's been speculated about for many years. And to my knowledge, and some of our audience members might know otherwise, I have never heard certainly not a sitting justice or a former one, ever saying that they would rule on a case against what they thought the right decision was in a trade-off for assistance on another. That said, the justices often strike up very close friendships and working alliances, often along ideological lines, but sometimes, as was the case with Antonin Scalia and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, across great ideological divides. So is it possible that friends or work colleagues might be more inclined to see another justice's opinion is legitimate when that justice has just given them their support? It's possible. And I suspect that a Supreme Court clerk is more in a position to share that with the rest of us than a justice, him or herself. So the short answer is we don't know. It's a reasonable suspicion, but one, at least to my knowledge, that's without evidence to back it up.
All right. Thank you for that. Okay, the next question is still kind of keeping with a similar topic here, talking about tariffs. What emergency does Trump think we're in, or I guess what emergency is he using to justify the tariffs that are currently ongoing?
Well, there's any number of emergencies pointed to. The one that he has done most consistently is talk about economic emergencies, particularly in the form of trade deficits. And he believes that the US running a trade deficit with other countries is an emergency that constitutes this type of action. Again, his critics point out that the US has run trade deficits with most of these countries for many years, if not decades. So it's certainly not new or not emergency in from their perspective. Trump and his advisors argue just the opposite, that one of the reasons the country is facing economic challenges is because this hasn't been dealt with previously. But now what's interesting, as they get to the Supreme Court, Trump and his lawyers have shifted their tack a little bit. And what they're saying now is the emergency is not simply one of economics and trade, but rather because, as they say, trade and international relations and national security are so intertwined, they argue that if the president were not able to use trade as a carrot or as a stick in broader negotiations, that that could cause physical peril to the United States of America. So they've made both arguments. The judges, at least so far, don't seem very convinced by either. But those are the two arguments we've heard most frequently. And the intertwining with national security has been there throughout, but it's become much more prominent as the case moved closer to and when it was actually heard.
All right, thank you. Okay, keeping on the same topic here, Trump has yet to ignore a Supreme Court ruling. Will this case, do you think, mark the first time that happens if they rule against him?
I don't think so. And thankfully, after several very, very difficult questions, that one is definitely more straightforward. Um, I think Trump, for all of his bluster and for all of his what we'll call charitably line smudging, has worked very hard, as has his lawyers, to make the case that they're either trying to abide by court decisions, um, that they are yeah, abiding by as much as they can. They have not yet said, as the questioner correctly pointed out, neither Trump nor his representatives have said, no, we are simply ignoring what the court says. Up until now, when they have not reacted, when they have not acceded to a court decision, they found some reason to offer as to why they haven't done it. So whether it's a good or bad excuse depends on the time and in your perspective, but they've never said, no, forget it, we're just not going to. Will that happen at some point? I have no idea. I don't think it's going to happen on that one. And the reason for that is that the White House has made it very clear that if the tariffs are overturned, that they do have other tools at their disposal to reimpose other tariffs, perhaps not identical, but whether for security reasons, whether on a temporary basis, there are fallback positions. And they've gone to great lengths to make sure that the media and the public know that they do have these fallbacks available. I doubt they'd be bothering to do that if they decided that this was where they wanted to stand their ground and begin a constitutional crisis.
All right, thank you. Okay, this is a little bit of a historical question here. In terms of trade and security, did US restrictions on Japan push them towards isolation and increase the likelihood of the 1941 Pearl Harbor attack?
Um, it's a great question, and I don't know the answer. I've read really compelling arguments on both sides that Japan, in many ways, even prior to that trade war, felt like they had often been humiliated at the hands of the West, and that the restrictive trade actions played a contributing factor in their decision to go to war. But most history points to other geopolitical matters, tensions in Asia, tensions and confrontation with Russia, and that ultimately Japan's move toward military action was based more on other military and international matters than economic ones. It's entirely possible that both were contributing factors. Um, like I said, I've read both arguments. Both make a strong case. If I had to guess, and it's just a guess, 84 years um, after the question came to bear, is that while the trade and economic tensions may have played a contributing role, they were not the driving force behind the emperor's decision to arm his country to that degree and ultimately to become so militarily aggressive.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dan. All right, I've got a long one here for you here. There we go. So this says, the Speaker of the House finally said this week that President Trump will not be eligible to run for re-election in 2028 and that he is aware of the limits set forth by the Constitution. He went on to say that the president loves to troll the opposition and the media with this concept. This seems like a pretty significant statement that didn't get the attention it might have otherwise in a less busy news cycle. What is the significance of this admission at this time? And if I can add my own little blurb in there, particularly opposing the recent interview with Steve Bannon, where he said it was a very real possibility that, and something that was something being discussed with the president, a potential third term.
One of Trump's most reliable techniques has been raising a concept sort of fancifully, just wondering out loud, and then writing it off as a joke. But what often happens is by raising a concept, even in jest, it becomes part of the dialogue. And his supporters in particular may embrace it more enthusiastically than just as a joke, or some more casual speculation. Trump has said categorically that he does not believe he is eligible to serve a third term. And in particular, and he made that point in a particularly emphatic way after Speaker Mike Johnson made it clear. Trump had been sort of vague about it. Johnson said, no, it is just simply not allowed. And for whatever his reason, Trump at that point became much more clear and much more definitive about it. That said, while he has been very clear and very definitive on this question, he's also made it clear that he would very much love to serve another term if it were available to him. As I've told you many times before, Maddie, I stopped making predictions about Donald Trump in November of 2016, and I learned my lesson. So I have no idea where this goes going forward. But it does appear, listening to how emphatically Johnson responded, and how Trump, how quickly he agreed with Johnson, suggests to me that Trump recognizes that there is sufficiently considerable opposition to the idea within his party that I don't think it's likely that he decides to seriously pursue this. But it wouldn't be the first time that something I didn't think was likely for him to do turned out to be just the case. But at least where we sit right now is, I think it's important to remember that, one, he's not only made that statement very specifically and concretely, but more importantly, to recollect the circumstances under which he made that statement. The fact that he did it in response to Johnson, who he doesn't always take all that seriously, suggests to me that somebody who he does respect told him that that might be a bridge too far within the Republican Party, even for Trump.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dan. Now, not just me and our audience are going to ask you to make a prediction, but not about Trump. So forgive us on this one. What do you make of Tuesday's blue wave? How do you think it's going to impact the midterm elections?
So I don't know that Tuesday was a blue wave. I mean, no question the Democrats performed far, far better than Republicans did. The Democrat, of course, was elected mayor of New York City. Democrats were elected governors of both New Jersey and Massachusetts. Excuse me, New Jersey and Virginia. My apologies. The judicial elections in Pennsylvania reelected 3 Democrats. and of course Proposition 50 here, which had become largely a partisan exercise, passed by a very, very large margin. So Democrats had an excellent day. But even though Virginia has currently had a Republican governor, that is more the exception than the rule. And so basically, where Democrats won on Tuesday are places where Democrats generally tended to do very well. I don't want to minimize the importance of their win, but what's much more important than those victories for the Democrats was the size of those wins. Uh, it was thought that the governor's race in New Jersey would be very close. It wasn't. There was a thought that Andrew Cuomo might be catching up to Mondami in New York. He wasn't. There was expectations that Spanberger in Virginia and Prop 50 here in California would win, but not overwhelmingly. They both won by landslides. And so I think what's important about the Democratic victories is if you're a Democrat, not to overreact, because they didn't win a lot of new turf. But I think what is important and why the Democrats should feel very, very good coming out of 2025 and heading into 2026 were those margins. And the reasons those margins were so large is because a lot of voters in the Democratic base, particularly young people and voters from underrepresented minority communities who did not turn out in particularly high numbers for Harris last year, turned out in overwhelming numbers this year. Trump, of course, had made significant gains among Black and Latino voters. He'd made some gains among young people as well. The gains that Trump made in 2024 completely reversed themselves and more this year. And then turnout was much, much higher in each of these communities than it had been a year earlier. So if you're a progressive Democrat, you point toward Mondami and say, we need to be a progressive party going forward. If you're a centrist Democrat, you point to Spanberger and Sherrill and say, centrist one, we need to be a centrist party going forward. This is a fight that the Democrats will have for the next 2.5 years until they pick a nominee. And when they pick a woman or a man to be the Democratic nominee for president, that individual's ideological grounding will decide where the party goes. Until then, they will argue amongst themselves which makes more sense. So very good night for Democrats. You'd certainly want to be in their shoes heading out than the Republicans. But it is just as a cautionary note worth remembering that Republicans, despite the passage of Proposition 50, are likely to gain more seats as a result of mid-decade redistricting around the country than Democrats are. And so while the Democrats had a very strong night, they had a strong night by claiming back what they could argue is rightfully theirs. They still need to, between now and next year, find a way to reach a bit further into Republican territory. So very good night for Republicans. Wave might be a little bit strong for where I'd go, but if you are a Democrat, and I know we've got a few on this call, you should feel very, very good what happened, but recognize that there are still significant challenges ahead. One last thing, because Jeff's about to cut us off, I need to correct something I said earlier. I misspoke when I was talking about Nancy Pelosi's ascension to the House of Representatives. And while it is accurate that she was encouraged to run very strongly by the late Phil Burton's widow, what I neglected to mention is that Sala Burton herself actually replaced her late husband in Congress for a short amount of time before convincing Pelosi to run. I'm not certain if I stated that Pelosi replaced Phil Burton directly, but if I did, what I should have said is succeeded him after a short interregnum. And I thank my good and smart friend Jennifer Poulakadis for politely reminding me of that. Go Bruins. Jeff, thank you so much for being here with us. We love having you as part of our team.
Well,
It's great to have you with us.
well, along with you, I'm a member of the Jennifer Polakidis fan club too. So thank you, Jennifer, for that. What a great conversation. And I was fascinated to see the results in the poll. And it was really enlightening. Maddie, thank you very much for moderating the Q&A. What an engaged audience that we have, that well over 100 people were able to attend. One of the things we want to do in 2026 is bring this program to life in person at venues across the city. So the way
Again,
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt. As many of you with long memories know, this started out as a breakfast series in Culver City before COVID forced us online. I'll be excited to do this in person again.
Yeah, and the way we're going to be able to do that is for those of you who are inclined, we would welcome contributions as your tax deductible contributions. There'll be a link in line. And for the others that want to stay and continue this conversation, have direct dialogue with Dan, we are going to pivot over to a members only Zoom link. And so that if you are a member of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and would like to join the World Affairs Council, just go to our website, lawac.org. And for those of you who are members, we'll be joining the one-on-one with Dan. You're free to turn over to that Zoom link now. But for those of you, the hundreds of people who tuned in today, and then we'll be watching it on YouTube when we re-air it, we really appreciate your participation. This is a fascinating conversation. And we'll see you next month at the December edition of the Dan Schnur Political Report. Have a good evening.
Thanks, everybody.